Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time a little bit later this hour talking about the Democratic presidential debates last night, as well as a couple of other issues in the news. Probably mentioned LeBron James one more time just because of some of the things that he's been saying and some of the comments that have come since then. But we have a lot of other issues to cover, and will do so. But we start off this particular segment with a good friend of this ministry, Representative Van Taylor, representing the 3rd Congressional District, individual that serves on 2 very influential House committees. And, of course, as we're going to be talking about just a little bit later, Syria, we certainly want to regard the fact that he has certainly looked at this not only from a political point of view, but as an individual that served in the military, was deployed to Iraq, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Representative Van Taylor, it's always great to have you on the program with us.
Oh, great to be here with you, Kerby.
All right, let's talk about impeachment. I've seen the impeachment map, even in the state of Texas, and there are some of your colleagues that say they're going to vote for impeachment. I've seen everything saying that Van Taylor would not. But I am starting to get the sense that the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is never really going to call for a vote on impeachment. But you know more about this than any of us, so that's why we wanted to hear your comments about what has been transpiring over the last couple of weeks there in the House of Representatives.
Sure. So, again, great to be on your show, and howdy to all your listeners out there. So if you go back in the last century, there were 2 impeachment trials. President Nixon and President Clinton were both impeached. And the House of Representatives passed an impeachment inquiry resolution, which was several hundred pages long, which gave a whole series of rights to the President of the United States. And these are rights that I think every American would expect in any criminal proceedings. They're guaranteed by the 6th Amendment to the Constitution: the right to a speedy trial, the right to an attorney, the right to cross-examine, the right to call witnesses, the right to introduce your own evidence. And so these are all things that I think all of us, cherish, that we assume that we would have in any judicial proceedings. And that President Clinton and President Nixon had in their impeachments. And what we find ourselves here today in the U.S. House of Representatives is that the President of the United States is not afforded those basic rights. The President of the United States is not allowed to have his attorney in the room. He's not allowed to read the transcripts of what witnesses say. He has not been allowed to introduce evidence, to call witnesses. So these are basic rights that I think every American would assume that would be given, certainly in something that is incredibly important and serious. And there are people that want to impeach the president. There are people that don't want to impeach the president. I think we can all agree that where we are on that particular issue, we can all agree that it's really serious, and that you would want to have a process that is fair, that is transparent, and that the rights of the accused are protected. And again, these are rights that I would submit, are constitutional rights that should be protected, and they have been protected by the Congress in the past. And it's surprising to be in an impeachment inquiry process where these rights are not afforded to the President of the United States.
Again, if you would like to know a little bit more about Van Taylor, we do have a link to the website. It's vantaylor.house.gov. A little bit later, we're going to, especially for some of you that are in the Texas area, going to benefit from perhaps some of the legislation he has introduced, one which is national on the TSA, another one on dual credit innovation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But let me come back to this whole idea of impeachment, because you have educated us that sometimes we have, if you will, kind of show bills that are passed by the House with the idea that it's never going to be enacted into law. They're not even written very well because they know that they will go to the Senate and nothing will happen. There gets to be a sense that this is sort of a show trial, in the sense that the Speaker of the House, first of all, is allowing this to be taking place behind closed doors. There's the idea that maybe there won't be a vote on impeachment. So it's just simply there to look like you're doing something, but not actually come to the point of actually having a vote up or down on the impeachment of the president.
Yeah, and that's actually just the nature of what's transpiring here in the U.S. Capitol is somewhat, to me, is very surprising. One of the rights in the Sixth Amendment is the right to a public trial. And what is happening here is actually the exact opposite. This is being taken place behind closed doors in a secret compartmentalized information facility, or a SCIF. A SCIF for the Intelligence Committee is used to discuss our nation's most sensitive secrets. Cell phones are not allowed in there. Notes that are classified cannot be taken out of the room. I've been in that room and my duties on the Homeland Security Committee. And I actually have a classified briefing in a SCIF opposite of that SCIF later this afternoon. But you're literally watching the testimony being taken place in the SCIF. Members are told not to discuss it, but then it's being leaked out to the press. And I mean, I was listening to CNN this morning as CNN analyst was discussing blow by blow what someone had said, even though members of Congress are told not to discuss it with anybody, and members of Congress like myself are not able to read the transcript of what was actually said in the room. So Van Taylor, member of Congress in the 3rd Congressional District, cannot see the transcript of what happened in the testimony that has been taken, and then I may or may not be asked to vote on impeachment without having had the opportunity to read the transcript. And this is the opposite of what happened under President Clinton and President Nixon. Again, you had a public trial. You had discussions in the open. It was televised. The public could watch it. And just imagine this: President Clinton's personal attorney was able to cross-examine Ken Starr, the special counsel, and discuss, and cross-examine witnesses again. Ken Starr was cross-examined by President Clinton's personal attorneys, and so this is so they were able to call a witness, they were able to cross-examine him, and again, these are basic rights that are guaranteed to every American in any criminal trial in the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that have been held as sacrosanct by this chamber, by the U.S. House of Representatives in the previous impeachment trials, but not in this one. You're watching something that has never happened in our country before, where you're watching, and again, this is very serious. This is a very serious decision. Removing the sitting President of the United States, who was duly elected, who received the 306 electoral votes that he needed to be made the President of the United States, the 45th President of the United States. You would hope that you would have everything done the right way, that we would be following precedent, and there is a roadmap to how this should be done, and it should be done the way that was done for President Nixon and President Clinton. Unfortunately, that is not happening here.
Well, let's take a break. And again, as the old guy around the table, I can remember how many of us were sitting around our television sets watching John Dean and a variety of other people testifying. And, of course, those of you that are younger maybe remember the Clinton impeachment issue. But even if you have not, this is unprecedented. So we talked about impeachment, but I certainly want to get some comments from Representative Van Taylor on Syria, as well as a couple of pieces of legislation he's introduced. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Ryan Anderson responds to our transgender moment in his new book, When Harry Became Sally. He begins his discussion by comparing two movies. The classic film, When Harry Met Sally, explored the question of whether a man and a woman can really be just friends. More recently, the film The Danish Girl asked a different question. Can a man really become a woman? The film was based on the true story of the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. America is in the midst of what has become the transgender moment. When he was on my radio program, we talked about how fast this all took place. Most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within a year it became the latest civil rights cause. He said that the book in many ways provides support for the actions by Dr. Paul McHugh. He is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School who raised important questions about the effectiveness of hormonal treatments and sex reassignment surgery. This 250-page book with 30 pages of endnotes attempts to provide a comprehensive look at the transgender movement and policies that have been proposed to address the demands of transgender activists. We also talked about how transgender concepts are being taught in the schools. There's the genderbread person that is supposed to help children sort through how their gender identity and gender expression relates to their biological sex. And there is the gender unicorn that is supposed to help them understand who they may be physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. He also documents how some young people exhibit gender dysphoria but later become more comfortable with their sexuality. Transgender activists have so misrepresented this book that I wonder if they even read the same book I read. That is one more reason why I recommend that you get the book and read it for yourself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Representative Van Taylor, individual that represents the 3rd Congressional District in the state of Texas. And again, we have a link to his website, vantaylor.house.gov. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about some of the legislation he's just introduced. But since you have served with distinction in the military, Van Taylor, I wanted to get your thoughts about Syria. I'm very concerned about this decision by the president. I'm concerned that we seem to be abandoning the Kurds, but I wanted to get your thoughts about some of the things that have transpired over the last couple of weeks.
Sure. So Syria has certainly moved very quickly over the last several days. It really has actually only been a week, if you can believe that, is how rapidly this has transpired.
Yes.
When actually my first press conference as a member of Congress, I was the lead Republican on a Democrat-authored bill calling for a responsible withdrawal from Syria, H.R. 914 by Tom Malinowski. And that was really asking, before the president before the U.S. withdrew from Syria, to make sure that things were stabilized, that things were in a good place, that we had a handle on everything, and that it wasn't it wasn't a chaotic retreat. And the decision came very rapidly. I was actually talking to people at the Pentagon yesterday morning. They had battle plans that had been drawn up from February that they were executing. And they're executing now in terms of the withdrawal. And we're driving most of our equipment and personnel into Iraq. My greatest concern for Syria is the concern that we do not leave open battle space, that a force like ISIS can rise again. It is unclear to me whether or not we've created that, whether or not that now exists. But that is my overarching concern. And we'll have to see how that works. You watch the administration take relatively strong sanction efforts against Turkey yesterday, and then you're watching. So again, this is moving very quickly, and we are actually voting in the U.S. House today on a resolution opposing the U.S. withdrawal from Syria.
And again, we'll watch on that resolution. And again, this is, I will admit, complicated. LeBron James was saying the other day that China is complicated. I don't think that is, but this is, because you have so many different players and so many different issues, from Assad to the Kurds, of course, Turkey intervening and all of the rest. But if indeed this resolution is passed, I don't know what can happen, because in some respects we do believe that the president is the commander-in-chief. And if at least you can convince the military to go along, and I think in most cases they do go along, this is almost a foregone conclusion, but it's something I know we want to pay attention to, and we'll keep talking about it here on Point of View. But I wanted to give you a few minutes just to talk about some of the local issues. Last time we talked about one of the pieces of legislation that you've introduced on the issue of the TSA, Traveling Parent Screening Consistency Act, and we can get back to that in just a minute. But I know just the other day you introduced a piece of legislation, and you can go to the website under the news section, and it's H.R. 4677, Dual Credit Innovation Act. And this is something that would be very significant to many of our listeners in the state of Texas. So talk about that. Sure.
So dual credit has been shown to be very important to helping children do better in college. So the University of Texas system did a study that was published last year showing that a student that had a single dual credit class entering into the UT system graduated at an average of one semester sooner. They were more likely to graduate from college and complete it successfully. They had a higher GPA, and they graduated with less debt. It seems obvious, but a more rigorous high school experience means a better performance in college. And dual credit is certainly creating that more rigorous high school experience. And you're seeing a very massive increase in dual credit classes across the state of Texas. I think I saw a recent statistic that's something like 650% in the last 5 years. So you're seeing a dramatic increase in dual credit, and I think that the schools in Collin County in particular are really leading the way in dual credit classes. And the Allen Independent School District has a dual credit academy that they're starting in a year and a half. And at that academy, a high school student would graduate with an associate's degree from Collin College upon graduation from high school. And that's obviously a huge boon to that student. It's a huge boon for that family. It's less debt. And from the taxpayer's point of view, the taxpayer was cutting the check to put the kid through high school anyway. So you're getting more out of the experience. I think it's better for the workforce, better for the student, better for families. And I really wanted at the federal level to recognize innovative programs like Allen ISD's partnership with Collin College to create this dual credit academy. So I'm asking for the Department of Education to create a new category in their Blue Ribbon Award system to give an award to the high school on a state-by-state basis that has really done the most innovative efforts in the previous year in the dual credit space, to really highlight that and to really hold that up as an example so that other parts of the state and other parts of the country can look and see, hey, these are some examples of ways people have innovated on the dual credit system. And they're introducing more dual credit classes to their students because I think that's really the way to take our education in this country to the next level, is to have a more rigorous high school experience. And again, as I understand it, it would create a dual credit innovation award within the Department of Education, just kind of focus on that. And even my own personal experience before we had all that, even if you were to take advanced placement classes, back in my day, that was a way that you could go into college having credit. And given the fact that these students sometimes graduate with enormous student debt,
This is a way to, first of all, accelerate the students that have that academic ability, and number two, reduce the financial burden on them and their parents. So I just think it's an outstanding piece of legislation, and I just wanted people to know about that. But if people wanted to know more about this, of course, I mentioned this other piece of legislation that you've been a part of as well, the Traveling Parent Screening Consistency Act for the TSA. Talk about what's available on your website just before we go, because there are just a lot of ways that people can connect up with you. And, of course, more recently, I know you've also announced some of the Veterans Commendation recipients as well.
Sure. You're definitely welcome to go to my website, and you can sign up for email updates. You can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. And the other thing that we've got going on Saturday, October 26th, at 10 a.m. at Collin College Pre-K campus, we're honoring 12 veterans from Collin County for their service to our country with the Congressional Veteran Commendation ceremony. Very excited about that. It's a way to highlight members of our community who have served our country in uniform and then gone on to serve in our community. And so we've got some great people there, and I'm really excited. John Wayne Walding, who risked his life and gave his leg in Afghanistan fighting as a Green Beret, will be there. He's our keynote speaker. So excited about him. It's going to be a great ceremony, a great event. And I'll just say that having seen those events before, it's a really exciting experience just to hear. You're going to hear not just John Wayne Walding's story, but hear about these 12 people who have served our community and served in uniform, and they each have a unique story. And it's just really, really fun to hear their story and to honor their service to our country and our community.
Again, Saturday, October 26th, it'll be at Collin College, the Spring Creek campus, but you can find out a lot more by simply going to vantaylor.house.gov, and we, of course, have that link on our website as well. Representative Van Taylor, always great to have you on the program, and I know you'll be voting on the resolution today, so we'll pay attention to that and talk about it tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, sir.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, get into a couple of issues. Jim Garrity says, you can't script October in either baseball or politics, and certainly that's the case with baseball. Did anybody expect the Washington Nationals to sweep the St. Louis Cardinals, especially when you recognize that in the past when they've had a talent-laden Washington Nationals team, they didn't get this far, and they did this time. And it's even more ironic, as Jim Garrity points out, that if you look back on May 23rd, Washington Nationals had 19 wins and 31 losses, but they'll be in the World Series. So if you can't predict baseball, I'll also say you can't predict politics, but I'll give you my suggestion on how did certain candidates do last night, who might be the odds-on nominee to run against Donald Trump, and so we'll get into some of that. And by the way, if you'd like to join us, we've already talked about everything from impeachment to Syria. We could get into a couple of other issues, not the least of which is, what about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment? Former members of Congress, like Beto O'Rourke, say, well, we'll just take away your tax-exempt status. That's affecting the First Amendment if we disagree with your views. And we might take away your ARs and AKs because you shouldn't have them. That's the Second Amendment. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do that right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's talk a little bit about the debate last night, and we'll get into more of that the next hour for a national audience. But one of the things Jim Garrity pointed out is that this was actually a pretty good night for two individuals that were sort of sliding into irrelevance, and one of those is Amy Klobuchar, who is from Minnesota, and then, of course, Pete Buttigieg, who is a mayor. And they were kind of sliding into irrelevance, but they really, in some respects, held their own. Now, Mayor Pete is actually now at 12% in Iowa. And you might say, well, that's not a lot. Well, it's the only person other than the top three that's in double digits. And so that means he might stay around for a while. He's at 8.7% in New Hampshire. So that's still significant. So the mayor of South Bend, I think, is going to be here for a while, and certainly we'll talk about him later, especially since there are some points that he made, and the point back and forth between him and Beto O'Rourke, pretty interesting as well. But interestingly enough, let me talk about Amy Klobuchar for just a minute. Don't really talk about her too much. I got a feeling that her days are numbered. But one of the things that Jim Garrity points out in his piece is that being Minnesota nice sometimes seems boring. But one of the tricks that she has been able to pull out of her bag is that she can figure out a way to very politely but very firmly poke holes in especially Elizabeth Warren and Elizabeth Warren's policies and arguments, which makes it then more difficult that when the senator says, you're attacking me because I'm the only one standing for the people, sound a little bit overdone because we're just pointing out some of this doesn't work, Senator Warren. And so there were a couple of lines that I thought I would use. One that Amy Klobuchar said, at least Bernie's being honest here and saying how he's going to pay for this and that taxes are going to go up. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, meaning Elizabeth Warren, but you have not said that, and I think we owe it to the American people to tell them where we're going to send the invoice. Great line. Maybe she'll get some bump in the polls with those kinds of lines. I don't know. I know that oftentimes in the stage environment and in the audience, you have mostly activists that probably are very progressive, fairly on the left side. So maybe they don't like those kinds of comments. But I think for the average American out there who's a Democrat, who's wondering if the Democratic Party is going to go off the cliff, it sounded a lot wiser than maybe what we've been hearing. And I might also mention Tulsi Gabbard had a couple of lines like that as well. But let me get you the other two, because a little bit later, Amy Klobuchar said, I appreciate Elizabeth's work, but again, the difference between a plan and a pipe dream is something that you can actually get done. Wow, that was pretty good. And there were a couple of people that are kind of making those kinds of statements last night, because I think some of the more, and I hate to use the word centrist, because even the person that's like a moderate Democrat is a very liberal Democrat compared to where our understanding of the spectrum, political spectrum was. But nevertheless, those that aren't as radical, they were trying to say, can we pull this back from the cliff? Because if not, there is not even a chance that any one of these candidates making these outlandish statements is going to be successful against Donald Trump. And then one other one. She said, and I saw this one and made me smile here away, I want to give a reality check here to Elizabeth because no one on the stage wants to protect billionaires. Not even the billionaire wants to protect billionaires. And I thought it's kind of interesting because, as I've said on this program many times before, there are so many individuals that sort of make this pious understanding that I understand what it's like to be the average American. And yet, let's face it, I think everybody on this stage is a millionaire. Some are billionaires. Let's just recognize that they all are. And it always has caught me just a little bit interesting that if you listen to some of these congressional hearings, you'll have one millionaire arguing with another millionaire about, I understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. No, you don't. I mean, maybe you have a little bit of empathy for that, but you really don't, and you haven't for some time, because these are all individuals that make a lot of money and have made a lot of money and have connections that have allowed them to run for office. That's just reality. But nevertheless, one of the things I thought was most interesting is Mayor Pete at one point kind of came after Beto O'Rourke because there was this idea that, well, you don't really understand, you really don't care about the people. And Jim Garrity has the best way to say it. Progressive Democrats get used to being able to play the I care about people and you don't card against their opponents. And then they're really shocked and indignant when their own style of criticism is turned against them, because that is the case. Mayor Pete Buttigieg said, the problem isn't the polls, the problem is the policy. And I don't need lessons from you on courage, political or personal. Everyone on the stage is determined to get everything done. So, again, the idea that sometimes they've used this against Republicans, and oftentimes Republicans just kind of fade away and don't say anything, it might work well in a general election. by saying that these Republicans don't care about you, so I'm the one that cares. You need to vote for me. But you have everybody on the stage saying, we all care, so to stop using it against each other. And I thought that was, I think, very instructive. When we come back at the top of the hour, I want to talk a little bit more about especially some of the failures. One of the most significant is, of course, Joe Biden. And matter of fact, as I talk about this, I'll go into that in more detail. I was interested to see this one Twitter account where one of the individuals said, images from Biden's campaign headquarters, and it's a picture of a dumpster on fire, that the campaign is a dumpster fire. So we'll get into some of that as well. And just one other point before I move on. Since we are broadcasting primarily in the state of Texas, although we certainly acknowledge those of you up in Minnesota and others that will be listening soon from Chicago and other places during this hour. Before we do the national hour, I'd always like to talk about Texas. And both Texans in the presidential race probably are out very soon. Money is so important in running a national campaign. And Julian Castro has about $1 million in his campaign fund. And $1 million is not going to get him anywhere. Beto O'Rourke has about $3 million in there. And so it's very clear that some of these campaigns are sort of running on fumes, and that is not good for their future. If you're already that low in terms of fundraising now in October, when it comes time for running in the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary, the South Carolina primary, it's pretty much over. And so I think that is the case. One other point that I thought was interesting is, of course, we even mentioned yesterday on the program on our Millennial Roundtable, the comment and the various negative comments aimed at Ellen DeGeneres, who was at somebody put here baseball game. It was a football game. Sorry about that. I was just reading it and it's wrong. It was at the Cowboys game, but okay. Ellen DeGeneres was at a football game with former President George W. Bush, and there was all sorts of criticism about that. And so that led to an interesting question last night. Can you actually identify somebody that is on the other side of the aisle that you actually consider a friend or that you hang out with? And it's not surprising. Beto O'Rourke mentioned Representative Will Hurd, who's going to be stepping down. But again, Will Hurd is probably one of the more moderate, if you will, Republicans. And they actually took a cross-country trip together. Senator Kamala Harris mentioned Senator Rand Paul, which was a bit of a surprise, although they have worked on criminal justice reform. And nobody was terribly surprised when you had former Vice President Joe Biden mentioning Senator John McCain, because they were pretty good friends. But what was disappointing, again, while we're talking about the state of Texas, is Julian Castro from Texas, former HUD secretary, never gave an answer. I mean, he said things like, well, some of the most interesting friendships I've had have been with people different than me, either people older than me or people who grew up different from me. He also teaches when I was growing up, people who had a life experience but he could never give the answer. And so this rambling answer just kind of illustrated, guess what? I simply don't have anybody that I could consider a friend who has an R next to their name. That was really kind of what we were getting there. I might also mention that Tulsi Gabbard also mentioned Representative Trey Gowdy, and also took the time to call out Hillary Clinton for dismissing half the country as being deplorables because they wanted to vote for Donald Trump. And so Julian Castro was not done, though. He actually protested later in a tweet saying that we never heard anything about climate change, housing, immigration. I might add a few from the conservative side. Religious liberty. You know, after all, are we going to pull the tax-exempt status from individuals? But nevertheless, he was trying to regain some of that as well. And it was interesting that those questions never were asked. So we'll spend a little more time looking at the Democratic presidential debate last night in the next hour. When we come back, I do want to focus on one other kind of Texas story, and that is our Fort Worth police officer and what is transpired there. It is not only a Texas story, it has become a national story, so we'll talk about that. But if you would like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, of course, we'll be talking with Vernon Brewer about what we can do to help Syrian refugees And then John Townsend will be with us in the third hour as we talk about his new book, People Fuel. So we have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to spend just a few minutes, if we can, on the Fort Worth shooter and the reaction to it. Now, for the national audience, of course, this has become a national story, but for the local audience, you may have noticed last night when you were watching the news that the Fort Worth City Council was jammed with people, not only in the chambers, but outside the chambers, and there were people waiting in line to testify on this issue. But because the mayor of Fort Worth actually wanted to keep the agenda, and this is one of those times, and I've never been mayor, never will be, but if I were the mayor, I'd say we'll just postpone all the other agenda items and let people speak to this issue, because what exactly was happening is people get up there wanting to testify, quote, on one of the other items on the agenda, and then just use that to talk about and to vent about the shooting that took place in Fort Worth. And so as a result, there was even growing frustration that we can't get up there and be able to express our opinion. So that's when you started hearing the chant, which I think we're going to hear more and more. We don't feel safe. We don't feel safe. And that is something that I'm going to write about maybe in a future commentary, because it's now at least the third time in which I've had people making the very profound argument that I don't feel safe, when, if anything, the statistics and the reality is just the opposite. let me get off of this one for just a minute and recognize when we talk about school shootings. Even last night in the presidential debate for the Democratic candidates, they talked about we spend more time teaching the kids how to duck and cover, blockade their room, than we do to even get involved in a fire drill, because I think of the concern that there could be a school shooting. And I don't want to have this come off sounding crass at all, but let's just recognize how many students there are in this country, how many schools there are in this country, how few of those individuals, even going all the way back to Colorado, the very first kind of really prominent shooting, how many have actually been shot. And the reality is students are unbelievably safe and will be even safer now that we've implemented some of these policies, which require individuals to have a card, a key card or something like, to get into the school or go through any kind of metal detectors and do some things to just make them more safe. But yet there are lots of young people go to school absolutely terrified that they might be shot tomorrow, when the reality is that even hundreds of a fraction of a percent might ever even be engaged in something like a shooting. But that's the place we find ourselves right now. Let's take another one. Climate change. I pointed out just the other day when I was on the program here that there's now a whole area of counseling to counsel people that are just terrified about the future of this country and the world because of the fears about climate change, and that people are deciding to maybe hole up in the basements. We found one couple in the basement the other day. They didn't know where they went. They were in the basement. They were just just covered with fear. The number of people that are convinced that climate change is going to end the world as we know it. And so, again, this issue of climate change, when we live in a time of the greatest affluence we've ever had, and also the greatest reduction in pollution, at least in this country, maybe not in China, but in most places, we are enjoying a level of wealth and fitness, health and wealth, that we've never had before. And yet people are terrified. Then we come, of course, to the police shootings. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to talk about the fact that we've had some really bad shootings, and this is one of those. And we can talk about a couple of other people I mentioned yesterday on the program, Andrew Scott and Philando Castile and Willie McCoy and a few others that have obvious bad shootings. But again, if you're African American and you are convinced that you're going to be shot by the police and you are saying we don't feel safe, the reality is, when you look at all the individuals in America and all the shootings, the number of people that are even involved in some kind of altercation, you live in a very, very safe world. And we don't live in a world where there is terrorist attacks right now, where there's war taking place. We are some of the most blessed people in the world, but yet we are just captivated by this issue of fear. And so there are some psychologists talking about why we are so fearful at a time when really, from a evolutionary point of view, if you want to look at it from a non-Christian point of view, or from a Christian point of view, and you want to look at history, we live in a very safe time, really. But you wouldn't know that, of course, because the focus that especially comes from the media is to look at any one of these potential threats and to blow them sometimes out of the water. Does that then suggest that there is nothing that the police can do? One of the things that David French points out is that the police have a very difficult job. And if indeed the police had changed some of the procedures by pulling up in front of the house, maybe clearly identifying themselves as police into an open door, rather than to go by a flashlight into the backyard, which required opening up the gate to the back fence, shining a light in there. I'm telling you, at 2:30 in the morning, if I see somebody in the backyard with a flashlight, I'm going to do the same thing that Atiana Jefferson did. She pulls out a gun out of her purse, and of course we know the rest of the circumstances. So it seems to me that, as he has pointed out in his very good piece, police make mistakes sometimes on the front end that heighten their own sense of danger. There's that word fear again. And since they're fearful that something might go the wrong way, because even a routine police stop, traffic stop, can on very rare occasions escalate to deadly violence. Most of them do not. But as David French points out, poor tactics can yield terrible results. And yesterday I used the example of an individual who actually is in his own home. The police show up at the wrong house without a search warrant, did not turn on their lights, did not identify themselves as police, pounded on the door late at night. This individual, Andrew Scott, answers the door with a firearm in his hand, and he's shot right then. Well, guess what? Doesn't take long to see that something went wrong long before Andrew Scott opened the door. Or, of course, I mentioned Willie McCoy just a few minutes ago. Here's a man that actually was sleeping in his car. Because he knew he could be in a dangerous area, so he had a gun on his lap. Well, then all of a sudden, when they wake him up, recognize how when you wake up, you kind of don't know where you are for just a minute. You see people shouting at you, you see lights and everything. Again, the natural reaction is to grab for your gun, and within seconds, you can see the video cam. They're just shooting all over the car. And simply because they startled him to wake, they then killed him. And so these are some cases which I think illustrate, again, that we support people in law enforcement. We recognize that this is a difficult job, and individuals sometimes get placed in difficult situations, and they themselves are fearful. But you can also understand the other side of that when people are shouting, "We don't feel safe," at the Fort Worth City Council. And so it's an issue that deserves more attention and more discussion. And, of course, we'll have that here on Point of View. When we come back from the break, though, for the national audience, we're going to get into a little more discussion and a more complete discussion of this whole issue of who might be the nominee that will actually run against Donald Trump. What are some of the key issues, and who is starting to break out from the pack, and who might be leaving the pack very quickly. So far for the November debate, now only 8 individuals qualify of the 12 that were there last night. It's quite possible 1 or 2 might qualify, but you're starting to see the winnowing out that will take place. And then, of course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, when you look at how little money some of these individuals have in their campaign coffers, unless something changes dramatically, they're going to be out as well. So we're going to talk about that, and then we'll talk about what we can do to help Syrian refugees. A very good opportunity for us to do good. We'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Last night was the Democratic presidential debate, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, and we'll certainly get your comments about what is taking place so far and who might be the actual odds-on nominee to run against Donald Trump, so we'll get into that. We have some other information that we want to look at in terms of a very good letter written by Dennis Prager, an open letter to Sergey Brin, who is the head of course, Google, and now actually owning YouTube. And it's I'll read that a little bit later because I thought you'd appreciate that. LeBron in Hong Kong, we'll get into that a little bit, but I thought we'd spend just a few minutes, if we could, talking about the debate last night, and it was full of a number of surprises. One of those is that a few individuals that might have slipped into obscurity did relatively well. Pete Buttigieg is, of course, the mayor of a very important city, and an individual that has been able to do relatively well. If you look at the various polls that have come out, of course, you got your top three. You've got Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. But if you drop beneath them, the only other person other than the big three that is in double digits is Mayor Pete, and he's at 12% in Iowa, 8.5%, almost 9% in New Hampshire. So I think the South Bend mayor is going to be around for a while. But the other person, especially for our listeners up there in Minnesota, was Amy Klobuchar, who actually, of course, has never really had a chance to break out and figured out last night a way to do so. Because some people have said, well, Minnesota nice sometimes is a synonym, as Jim Garrity says in a recent column, for boring. But she figured out a way to kind of firmly, but politely, point out some of the problems with the now front-runner, Senator Elizabeth Warren. I'll come back to why I think she's the front-runner in just a minute. But, for example, at one point she said, at least Bernie's being honest here and saying how he's going to pay for this and that taxes are going to go up. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, that'd be Elizabeth Warren, but you have not said that, and I think we owe it to the American people to tell them where we're going to send the invoice. That was a great line. We'll see whether or not her stock rises, because there was an attempt on the part of Tulsi Gabbard, Amy Klobuchar, and really even a little bit of Pete Buttigieg, that were trying to say, wait a minute, guys, you know, this train, this Democratic train is about ready to go off the cliff. You're taking such radical ideas and you're trying to implement such policies that are going to maybe appeal to some of your maybe more radical primary voters, but it's going to completely turn off individuals that you need to vote for you in the general election. And so, again, one of the other comments by Amy Klobuchar, I appreciate Elizabeth's work, but again, the difference between a plan and a pipe dream is something that you can actually get done. And one of the other things I appreciate Jim Garrity pointing out is that in the past, there's always been kind of this idea that one of the stock and trade answers for your typical progressives, which mostly tended to be in the Democrat Party, but not exclusively, but certainly most of the progressives are in the Democrat Party, are I care about people and you don't, so you got to vote for me. And one of the things he was pointing out is the interaction between Mayor Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, and Beto O'Rourke was interesting because at one point Buttigieg says, the problem isn't the polls, the problem is the policy. And I don't need lessons from you, meaning Beto O'Rourke, on courage, political or personal. Everyone on the stage is determined to get something done. And you had the same kind of argument made later by Amy Klobuchar, in which she said, I want to give a reality check here to Elizabeth because no one on the stage wants to protect billionaires. Not even the billionaire, meaning on the stage, wants to protect billionaires. So there's pretty good lines in there in which there were at least some that might identify themselves as maybe more moderate. Moderate with quotes around it. I'm putting air quotes around it because these are not those moderate of kind of people that we used to identify in the past. But at least some of those moderates actually, and the Democrat Party are starting to say, we need to pull back here a little bit. And, of course, one of the things that I think illustrates where this particular campaign is going are the troubles that, interestingly enough, Joe Biden is facing. And there's a good piece that came out just the other day in Town Hall really talking about why, in some respects, I'm starting to see, and if you've gone out on Twitter lately, you've actually seen this one Twitter post. It's just really something. Live images from Biden, I should say, campaign headquarters, and it's a picture of a garbage dumpster on fire. It's a dumpster fire. And the reason for that is, first of all, you had the question from Anderson Cooper to former Vice President Joe Biden about his son, Hunter Biden. And he insisted that my son did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. I carried out the policy of the United States in rooting out corruption in Ukraine. That's what we should be focusing on. Then he went on to say, I never discussed a single thing with my son about anything having to do with Ukraine. No one has indicated I have. What? How about the fact checks that have come out, and even CNN with their fact check pointing out that Hunter Biden himself said the opposite. That does not work so well. The other thing that has dogged this former vice president, is not only the Ukraine issue, but mental sharpness. And here's where it starts getting a little bit dicey in terms of the fact that he says, well, there were two people that were influential. One was Senator John McCain, and then he never mentions the other one. And so, okay, well, anybody can forget one. I mean, Rick Perry did that, and of course, that was the end of his campaign. But then he had trouble trying to even keep straight the countries in the Middle East. This is a person that served for 8 years, is the vice president, and served really since a few decades ago as a United States senator from Delaware. He mistook Iraq for Syria. He said he would not have withdrawn troops, and I would not have withdrawn the additional 1,000 troops who are in Iraq. Well, they're in Syria, that they're in there. And so there were some issues there as well. And so after a while, you began to wonder about his, if you will, mental sharpness. And then he was asked about the tax plan by Sanders and Warren. And he says, well, you shouldn't be demonizing wealth. Then he goes through this long discussion of why in God's name should anyone who's clipping coupons in the stock market in fact, pay a lower tax rate than someone who, in fact, is, like I said, the school teacher or the firefighter. It's ridiculous, and they pay a lower tax. Secondly, the idea that we, in fact, engage in the notion that there's tax loopholes. There's a minimum of $600 billion of that. We would eliminate it all, and we would still go into the detail had all the time. And, of course, lots of times he never finishes his sentence. But at one point, he does point out something that we've talked about on this program for years, and that is you could shut down the United States military. You could get rid of the Defense Department. You could no longer have a U.S. military. And as he points out, I'll use his numbers for a minute, that would fund the federal government for 4 months. Now, that sounds like something you'd hear from Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, the Heritage Foundation. Of course, I've talked about those kinds of things as well. So, of course, there wasn't just a big applause line after that, but it's interesting to hear some of the things that were said in the debate. When we come back, I mentioned who's your closest friend. That was insightful in a lot of ways. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Ryan Anderson responds to our transgender moment in his new book, When Harry Became Sally. He begins his discussion by comparing two movies. The classic film, When Harry Met Sally, explored the question of whether a man and a woman can really be just friends. More recently, the film The Danish Girl asked a different question. Can a man really become a woman? The film was based on the true story of the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. America is in the midst of what has become the transgender moment. When he was on my radio program, we talked about how fast this all took place. Most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within a year it became the latest civil rights cause. He said that the book in many ways provides support for the actions by Dr. Paul McHugh. He is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School who raised important questions about the effectiveness of hormonal treatments and sex reassignment surgery. This 250-page book with 30 pages of endnotes attempts to provide a comprehensive look at the transgender movement and policies that have been proposed to address the demands of transgender activists. We also talked about how transgender concepts are being taught in the schools. There's the genderbread person that is supposed to help children sort through how their gender identity and gender expression relates to their biological sex. And there is the gender unicorn that is supposed to help them understand who they may be physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. He also documents how some young people exhibit gender dysphoria but later become more comfortable with their sexuality. Transgender activists have so misrepresented this book that I wonder if they even read the same book I read. That is one more reason why I recommend that you get the book and read it for yourself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the things you can learn if you watch a debate, whether it's a Republican debate or Democratic debate or anything, the individual that is being attacked is probably the presumptive leader in the polls at that point, and that's why so much focus was on Elizabeth Warren last night. Senator Elizabeth Warren came into this debate with a great deal of momentum, and there's a couple of reasons for that. About 10 days ago, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews on, and his article in The Hill surfaced, and he had 4 very good reasons why she's doing well. Number one, she says, I have a plan for that. Well, whether you like the plan or not, she's always looking prepared. Number 2, she is a very gracious individual around potential supporters, whereas Hillary Clinton sometimes would be ushered off the stage the moment after she finished speaking, almost didn't look like she wanted to talk to people. Elizabeth Warren will stay there taking selfies for hours sometimes, and you will see that. Number 3, she's sort of, if you will, inheriting some of the supporters of Bernie Sanders. After he had his heart attack and after a lot of people said, you know, maybe this isn't going to work so well, having a socialist running against Donald Trump, having a white male, an old white male running against an old white male, maybe that doesn't work so well. So if you like the socialist policies but you don't want the socialist label, number 3, Hillary Clinton wasn't your person, but Elizabeth Warren is. And number 4, of course, she is a woman, and that provides a contrast to Donald Trump and even could use some of the victimology there. She's gained a great deal of momentum for a 5th reason, and that is she really seems to be on a roll. And last Thursday, when CNN had their equality town hall, there was a question that came from one of the chair people. Matter of fact, I think it is the chairman of the Human Rights Campaign. Let's say you're on the campaign trail and a supporter approaches you and says, Senator, I'm old-fashioned. My faith teaches me that marriage is between one man and one woman. What is your response? She said, well, I'm going to assume that that's a guy, which got a little bit of applause and cheer. And then before it added, but I'm going to say then just marry one woman. I'm cool with that, assuming you can find one. And then, of course, the place breaks up, and this turned out to be one of these viral moments. And so for a lot of reasons right now, Elizabeth Warren is sort of the odds-on favorite. But again, recognize not one caucus has taken place, not one primary has taken place. This is only in the midst of the debates. But I thought it was kind of intriguing. And some of the comments that were mentioned the other night were, interestingly enough, avoided this time. And that is, Julian Castro pointed out that there were no questions on climate change. There were no questions on housing. There were no questions on immigration. I'll take his word for it because I didn't keep track of all of them. Somebody else pointed out, just from our point of view, there were no questions on religious liberty. And in just a minute, I want to talk about Beto O'Rourke, who seems to be going after not only the Second Amendment, your ARs and AKs, but your First Amendment in terms of your tax exemption. But I thought there was an interesting opportunity when you talk about the LGBTQ issue to see the question about who would you consider a person who is maybe a Republican that you would have a friendship with? Because this is obviously brought up because Ellen DeGeneres enjoyed getting together at the Dallas Cowboys football game with President George W. Bush, got a lot of flack for even saying some positive things about somebody she may disagree with. And so as you went around the round table, you had Beto O'Rourke, who said that, well, his friend would be Representative Will Hurd, who is actually stepping down, but more of a moderate Republican, and they both took a cross-country road trip a while back. Senator Kamala Harris said, well, Senator Rand Paul, because they worked on criminal justice. And no surprise there, Joe Biden even said it would be John McCain because they had been close for some time. Tulsi Gabbard talked about Representative Trey Gowdy, and then took the time, again, I got to love this, took the time to call out Hillary Clinton for dismissing half of the country during the 2016 campaign. Remember, those were the deplorables that were going to vote for Donald Trump. And, you know, I think there's some people starting to say, if this becomes the face of the Democrat Party, not only are we not going to win the presidential election, we may not even keep the House. But we'll see where that goes. But it was striking to me that Julian Castro simply could not come up with an answer. And so it was just one of those places where, really, I mean, you shouldn't have been surprised by the question, number one. And number two, you should have been able to come up with some kind of stopgap answer, but it wasn't there. So kudos to Anderson Cooper and others asking those kinds of questions. But let me go back to that equality town hall last week, and that's where Don Lemon asked Beto O'Rourke, do you think that religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities should lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage? His quick answer was, of course, no. And then talked about the fact that any organization in America that denies the full human rights of every single one of us should not get a tax-exempt status. When that broke out, even other Democrats saying, that does not represent our view, then you had the O'Rourke campaign saying, well, they meant no rewards, benefits, or taxpayers would be conferred on institutions that take discriminatory action on same-sex marriage rather than discriminatory beliefs. Well, we'll see. But that was one of those issues. And then it is interesting that although there was a back and forth last night between Beto O'Rourke and Mayor Pete about, you know, whether or not you really would have either a mandatory buyback or a voluntary buyback, then even today on Morning Joe, the former Democratic congressman went again, had to try to explain that there would be consequences because the question was posed to him by Joe Scarborough that, okay, maybe you're talking about a rancher who says, I'm not going to do this because it's an unjust law and it's unconstitutional. So then, of course, he asks Beto O'Rourke, what's the next step? Well, O'Rourke says, yeah, I think just as in any law that is not followed or flagrantly abused, there have to be consequences or else there's no respect for the law. So, in this case, I think there will be a visit by the law enforcement to recover the firearm and make sure that it is purchased, bought back, so that it cannot be potentially used against someone else. So even though there has been kind of a equivocation about this idea of whether it would be a voluntary buyback or a mandatory buyback, I think you can see where that's going. And if you go and look at some of the more liberal news magazines, and I'll mention Atlantic as one of those, one very insightful article basically saying this has got to be dealt with because there are just too many individuals in the country who own a firearm who or else related to somebody that owns a firearm that are not going to feel comfortable with that being the, if you will, the de facto policy of the federal government. So we'll see where that takes us. And in just a few minutes, we're going to spend some time talking about what we can do to help out some of the refugees from Syria. Vernon Brewer will be with us, and I'll get into some of that. But I thought just before we take a break, I would encourage you to read a very good piece that came out in the Wall Street Journal, LeBron's Hong Kong education. And we did talk about this yesterday, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But one of the things that the editors said is holding up sports stars as moral arbiters is usually a mistake, as in the case, of course, as LeBron James and the Hong Kong demonstrates. The man who lectures America on its many sins went soft this week on the People's Republic of China, because they make the case later on in their piece that Mr. James knows little about Hong Kong, or he wouldn't have uttered what sounded like an apology for the harsh Chinese crackdown. And if nothing else, they say this would have been something, as editors of the Wall Street Journal, we would have ignored, except for the fact that LeBron James has many times actually held himself up, as they said, as, quote, the moral authority on America's supposed injustices. He often opines about political matters, and in a 2018 famously tweeted that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And so then they ask the question, such as people fighting for freedom against a communist government. And if nothing else, they use this as a double shot. This is where you call it a twofer, because then they go on to say LeBron James might hate the comparison, but his comments on Hong Kong are remarkably similar to Donald Trump. Now, the Wall Street Journal hasn't always been a fan of President Trump. They said the U.S. president has muted his criticism of China's abuses in Hong Kong, and last week even offered praise to a visiting Chinese official because the protest in the city had died down. And, of course, there's a reason for that, mass arrest and police violence. But nevertheless, that is a piece that I wanted you to see, and it's one that we will maybe come back to in the future. Might just mention that in the second hour today, I will read you this very well-written piece by Dennis Prager, An Open Letter to Sergey Brin. It is amazing how many times when I go through various articles, I find myself quoting from David French or Victor Davis Hanson, or in this case, Dennis Prager. Just very, very well written. But I want to give you a chance to hear a little bit more about what is happening in Syria. And so often we say, what can we do? We had Vernon Brewer on talking about what we could do to help those in the Bahamas. Now we're going to talk about what we can do to help those who are Syrian refugees. That coming up right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MetaShare MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to get back into the news in a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to do is give you an opportunity to do some good in another part of the world. And if you've been around this program for any length of time, you know that a while back we, for example, raised money for the Cradle Fund. And you might say, what was that? Well, it was the idea of the Cradle of Christianity Fund. We recognize that you had refugees from Iraq, Syria, and others that were in refugee camps, and we wanted to provide an opportunity for you to give to, especially in most cases, it was going to the pastors that were working in these refugee camps to distribute everything. And so sometimes there was food there, but it was clothing, it was blankets, it was all sorts of things. These people sometimes raced out in the middle of the night to escape ISIS. And so we raised the money and then passed it on to the Cradle Fund. In this particular case, I'm going to direct you to another group or ministry. And it is a ministry that we've already focused on in the past because we've talked about World Help. You might remember, if you've been listening more recently, that we had Vernon Brewer on, who is the founder and CEO of World Help, and we encouraged you to give to them so that they could minister to the people that were devastated by the hurricane there in the Bahamas. Now, I don't want you to stop giving or helping out those in the Bahamas. They certainly need you as well. But Syria has really been in the news lately. As a matter of fact, last hour in my local program, I spent time talking with a member of Congress about what is happening in Syria, Turkey going after the Kurds. There's just a lot of issues that we can get into, and maybe we will later in the week, in terms of what does this mean for the Kurds? What does it mean for the Christians? What about Assad? What about Turkey? On and on and on. But the bottom line is that there are a lot of Syrian refugees, and we thought that just as we had brought Vernon Brewer on to talk about what you could do to help those in the Bahamas, now we want to focus on this for a few minutes on what you can do through World Help for those in Syria. He is, I mentioned, of course, the founder and CEO of World Help, an individual that really has kind of become the trusted voice on Christian persecution, especially in North Korea. And so, Vernon Brewer, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Give me just a short update on the Bahamas. I know that you have had people on the ground, and I want to focus most of our time attention on Syria, but some people might say, I remember hearing about this, or maybe I gave to this, but I wasn't sure kind of what's happening next.
Well, we were able to be on the ground 2 days after the terrible hurricane hit. We flew in a whole plane load of generators and food and water and medicine, and we've been back on the ground several times since then. We have a network of partners on the ground, and the survival phase is over, and the loss of life is just so tremendous, but there are entire areas, as you know, have been destroyed, and the rebuilding process is just beginning. So we were able to be the hands and feet of Jesus at their time of greatest need, and will continue to stand with them in the days ahead.
And again, let me just encourage you to support any ministry. I mean, again, if you want to send money to the Red Cross, but these are individuals like at Samaritan Purse or World Help or others that are really not only providing food, resources, and other things, but of course sharing the gospel as well. And if you go to worldhelp.net, and we have a link there as well, you can find out about how to help a refugee, how to ship life-saving supplies, how to even secretly distribute Bibles in Iran, something that is just incredible. Many people believe that the fastest growing church, and I put church in quotes because these are not church buildings, but the growth of Christians is taking place in Iran. But let's talk about what is happening in Syria. That has been in the news, and I disagree with the actions by the president. I'm troubled by what Turkey has done, our NATO ally. We can have the political discussion for just a minute, but the reality is there are lots of Syrian refugees. And so, Vernon, I think some of our listeners are saying, is there anything we can do? What can we do to help some of those individuals that find themselves in such dire circumstances?
You know, Kerby, it's almost unbelievable and unthinkable that in the last week since Turkey invaded Syria, 68 civilians have been killed, hundreds and thousands more injured. They say that 160,000 Syrians have had to flee their homes, and that number could rise to as many as 300,000. 10,000 ISIS terrorists in prison have either escaped or are going to be let out. And in just 1 week's time, chaos has, not to mention what we've done with our allies, the Kurds, but chaos is once again rampant in that part of the world, which was already a terrible situation. The refugee camps were overcrowded and understaffed and under-equipped, and now they have 160,000 more refugees trying to get in. It's just unbelievable what has happened in such a short amount of time.
I might just mention, too, if anybody goes to my Facebook page, of course, I've posted about this Kurdish politician. The Kurds have always been pretty friendly to Christians, and she has been known as having championed Christians over the years, and she was just executed in Syria. So I wanted to post her face and just illustrate again what is happening. And I'm saddened, troubled, discouraged, and disappointed, and a lot of feelings simultaneously about what we find ourselves in. And we can have that political debate about what the president did or shouldn't have done and all of the rest. But the reality is we've got a lot of refugees. We have overcrowded refugee camps. So let's talk about, Vernon, what our listeners can do to help you. In some cases in the past, when we did the Cradle Fund, we collected the money, sent it on without taking even a percent out. But in this case, we just encourage people to go to your website, worldhelp.net, and tell us what they can do, whether they want to help with the victims of Hurricane Dorian or whether they want to help with those refugees in Syria.
Well, our international partners, Kerby, are located in the heart of the refugee crisis, right along the Syrian border. We're working in the camps. We're working in homes where refugees have 3 and 4 families living in one room. We're providing food and blankets and hygiene and heaters and just trying to keep them alive through the winter that's coming on. We provide trauma counseling. World Help is operating a clinic right on the Syrian border that sees 200 refugees a day, and we provide the doctors and nurses and the medicine to give them free medical care. Just last year alone, 1,000 of those refugees in the clinic became followers of Jesus Christ because they saw the love of Jesus Christ in action and said to our staff on the ground, we want what you have. Tell us how we can have what you have. So it's just incredible to see in the face of so much disaster, see the love of God drawing men and women to Jesus Christ. And so we say for as little as $35, that's enough to help one refugee family. We ship containers of food and medicine and clothing and medical care. And there's really no reason why every one of your listeners shouldn't be able to help at least one refugee. Last year we saved 134,000 refugee lives just in Syria alone. And so we have an opportunity. We can't not do anything, Kerby. We can't sit back and make this just a political issue. We have to realize that our allies have been abandoned. I remember a few years ago when I met with President Talabani, the president of Iraq, who was Kurdish. And I met in his office as a Christian. I gave him a Bible, and he thanked me profusely for having Christians love their people and help their people. And the fact that we've abandoned them at this time is just heartbreaking. But we can't let our political persuasion dictate what we do. As followers of Jesus Christ, we know what we've been commanded to do, and that's to show love and to show the love of Jesus Christ. And as little as $35, they can go on our website, worldhelp.net, and make a donation that would save a refugee's life.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the plight of persecuted Christians. And for those of you taking some notes, first of all, you might put down worldhelp.net, and I would encourage you to do something. Number two, for those of you that are in some aspect of ministry, you could be the pastor of the church, or you could be on the missions committee, or you might be a Sunday school teacher or something like that, I wanted to alert you. I know it's only October, but it'll turn around real quickly. November 3rd is the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. And so when we come back, I want to talk with Vernon Brewer for just a minute about persecuted Christians, and recognize that whether they're in the refugee camps ministering to Christians or especially to Muslims, one of the things that brings Muslims to the Lord, as we found out about recently when I interviewed a former Muslim, became a Christian, and now is a pastor, is sometimes they wonder, why are you doing this to us? We don't even necessarily theologically agree, and yet you're the hands and feet of Jesus. I want to know more about Jesus. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Vernon Brewer, because, again, I wanted to give you an opportunity if you and your family or your church would like to do something. In the past, we've talked about giving to the Cradle Fund, which stood for the Cradle of Christianity Fund, and that was to help some of the refugees from Iraq and Syria. And, of course, now we have this incredible number of Syrian refugees and so significant needs. And so we've already talked about the opportunity for you to participate. Let me just give you a program note that in the next hour, we're going to be talking for a little bit with John Townsend about his new book. Then we're going to get back into the news. A couple of things. I mentioned, of course, this very good letter by Dennis Prager to the head of Google, who also owns YouTube, and it's very well written, and it also takes us back to Russian refugees. We'll get to that in just a minute. Also, CNN fact-checked the president. The only trouble with the CN fact check is they forgot all the facts. So, again, don't always trust the fact checkers. Sometimes they make mistakes, and this one is huge, and it's one more reason to pay attention to some of the facts on the table and to be a little skeptical about things that are said. And so I hope that you will take the time to be with us in the next hour. We'll be talking about that as well. But again, Vernon Brewer with us, founder and CEO of World Help. And for just a minute, let's, if we can, talk about this upcoming International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. That takes place November 3rd. As we get closer, we'll announce it here on Point of View again. But I thought we'd give people an advance notice because I do believe, Vernon, that there is a need for the churches to talk more about the plight of persecuted Christians around the world. And that's one of the reasons why we bring on various groups over the years, Open Doors in the past, Voice of the Martyrs and others, and of course your group, World Help, because we need to be praying for our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world.
Well, you mentioned Iran a minute ago. It's the 9th most persecuted country in the world, and it's true that the Christianity is growing faster in Iran than any other country right now. It's unbelievable. In 1979, Kerby, there were only 500 known Muslim background believers in the entire nation of Iran. Today, fast forward 40 years, there are 800,000 Christ followers living in Iran. The reason that's estimated. The reason they don't know exactly for sure is because so many of them are meeting in secret.
Yes.
Because it's illegal to meet in a church publicly. And some people, including myself, believe that number of believers in Iran could be as many as 1 million believers. And so more Christians have come to faith in the last 20 or 30 years in Iran than the last 13. More Muslims have become Christians in the last 20 or 30 years in Iran than the last 1,300 years combined. So it's obviously God's doing something, and we need to find out where God's working. The greatest need they have is Bibles. And I just hope that November 3rd, that Christians all over the world will unite to pray for the persecuted church. As you probably well know, the number one persecuted church, persecuted country for 16 years in a row is North Korea.
Yes.
And there are only 300,000 believers in the whole country, and 70,000 of them are in concentration camps or just terrible conditions where the survival rate is only 3 years. They only last 3 years, where they're tortured and beaten for their faith continuously. And all they ever ask for, they don't want our sympathy. They ask for prayer, and they ask for more Bibles. So I would encourage your listeners to join on this International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, and remember our brothers and sisters in Iran and North Korea that are paying a great price for their faith.
Let me mention again, when you go to World Help, you'll see a place where you can provide help for a refugee. We'll talk about that just before I let Vernon go. But also then we have one for aid, for life-saving supplies, or then provide Bibles. And so there are opportunities for you, of course, as we've talked about in the past, to help the victims of Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas. But one more time before I let you go, let's talk about what individuals can do or churches can do in order to help these Syrian refugees.
Well, Kerby, these aren't people who are steeped in poverty. These are middle-class Syrians who have homes and send their children to school. They drive cars, and they've had to literally flee with just the clothes on their back, and now they're having to do it again. And they're living in tents or living in just terrible, terrible conditions. I was in one camp recently where a Syrian man came up to me carrying a 3-month-old baby, and he was speaking so fast and so loud in Arabic, the translator said he had just lost his wife. ISIS had murdered his wife in front of him, and his 3-month-old baby had pneumonia, and he was afraid she was going to die, and he wanted me to take his baby so that she would survive. If you can imagine that. And I put myself in the shoes of that father and said, we can't stand by and do nothing in the face of people who are dying needlessly. And so I would encourage your listeners to have compassion and not to have burnout with refugee burnout, but with these latest things that are taking place now in Syria, thousands and thousands of more are going to be homeless, and they need our help, and they need it now.
So again, some of you ask, what can we do? I just gave you a very important link, and if you're driving right now and you haven't had a chance to write down worldhelp.net, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We'll have all that information for you as well. In the past, you have really turned out when we did the Cradle Fund, and I know that some of you have already been involved in helping those through Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. Here's another issue. It's front and center. We're talking about the Syrian refugees. We're talking about what's happening in Syria. This is a great opportunity for you to participate. So Vernon Brewer, always great to have you on the program, and thank you for helping us figure out how we can do some good and be the hands and feet of Jesus. So thank you so very much for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, and thank you for being a light in the darkness. God bless you, my friend.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics, as we do so often. First of all, I'm going to have John Townsend with us for just a little bit. He's got this book, People Fuel. Crossed paths with him a couple of months ago, and, of course, we've interviewed him before, but that was the first time I had a chance to meet him face-to-face, and I thought this would be just a book that would be an encouragement to you. And then let me just mention that then we're going to get into a couple of issues. I already mentioned the fact that we have a CNN fact-checking that isn't using the facts. That's a problem. And, of course, this piece by Dennis Prager writing to the head of Google, and maybe I'll even get into some of the reaction to the Attorney General William Barr talking about faith and the secular left. And also, just as a program note, let me just mention tomorrow, since China has been in the news, we're going to be talking with Jerry Tuma about finances. And, of course, it looks like the China trade wars for the moment are on hold. But what does this mean for the economy? Then Eric Metaxas will be with us, a talk show host as well as author. And so we'll have a lot to cover. And then I'll still leave some time to get into some of the issues in the news, which is what we'll do in the second half of the next hour. But let me just mention that if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about what Vernon Brewer and they are doing at World Help, that's on the website. If you'd like to know more about the book we'll talk about in just a minute by John Townsend, People Fuel, that's on the website. And most importantly, my commentary today getting us into the whole issue of the transgender debate, and a very good book by Ryan Anderson entitled Harry Became Sally, and some of the sad story we're learning about transgender, including an article that was yesterday posted by Nick Pitts that we never really got to, the growing number of people reporting what you might call transgender regret. And so we'll get into some of that as well. But that's on the website. So if you find yourself finding any of those topics are of interest, simply go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation, have a conversation with John Townsend, and then get back into the news right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time talking about relationships, first half hour, and then we're going to get back into the news. And you've heard people say, if I got $1 for every time I, and then fill in the blank. Well, really, if I got $1 for every time I endorsed or recommended the book Boundaries, I certainly would have a fair amount of money. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I've known Dr. Henry Cloud since he was an undergraduate student at SMU. I know when you're an old guy, you've been around for a while. And, of course, the co-author, John Townsend. And the two of them have written such an outstanding book that I find myself so often recommending that book. And I'm going to add one to the list, and it's one that has come out here by John Townsend. Dr. John Townsend is the author of the book People Fuel, Fill Your Tank for Life, Love, and Leadership. It is published by Zondervan, about 200 pages, and a book that I think you really need to know about. So we're going to spend some time talking about it briefly. If you're not familiar with John Townsend, of course, he is a nationally known leadership consultant and author, psychologist, individual that co-founded the Minirth Meyer Clinic West. Also, of course, has extensive graduate degrees, doctorate, first of all, from Biola at the Rosemead School of Psychology, but even before that, a degree from Dallas Theological Seminary, and joins me now by phone. And John Townsend, great to have you back on the program with us.
Thanks, Kerby. Great to be here.
You know, I have mentioned you many times before. I've interviewed you by phone, but just the other day I got you meet you face to face, and that was really helpful as well. And as we get into this book, let's talk about this, because you're actually hosting a leadership group, and you're asking them to begin to talk about what you need, and all sorts of things are showing up on the whiteboard, an alignment of vision, great product, innovation, on and on and on. When the answers die down, then you put up on the very large letters, you need to need. And everybody's like, huh? What does that mean? And it brings us right into the fact that they were mentioning what you might call functional needs, but what you were talking about and what you're talking about in this book are relational needs. Can you explain?
Yeah, you got it, Kerby. Yeah, I was talking to a group, and the idea was there's things that we have to do on a task level, whether it's leadership or whether it's raising a family or marriage, things like pay the bills, make sure you're working out and staying in shape and go to church. But there are also what are called relational needs, which is the needs we have for each other. Because the model that I use in this new book is that, we all are into health these days. Bionutrients are a big deal. We're supposed to have, eat right, have supplements. And so if you don't have enough calcium in your body, you get bone disease, osteoporosis. If you don't have enough iron in your body, you get, anemia, right? And the same way, I believe that God gives us relational nutrients from each other, and not by a capsule or a supplement, but in conversations from my brain to yours and your brain to mine, because the neuroscience just backs up what the Bible says. And there's so many Bible verses about how we need to need each other. So many Christians, Kerby, they go, well, I need the Lord. Yeah, we need the Lord. He made everything. And I need my spouse, absolutely. And I need my Labrador Retriever, Max, because Max licks my face when I'm discouraged. Well, God does it anyway, and your spouse is tired, and Max is genetically engineered to lick you anyway because he knows he won't eat. We've got to have other sources of relational nutrients, and they come from each other.
Yes. Well, and one of the illustrations you used here, having gone to Dallas Theological Seminary, and by the way, I just had Bill Hendricks in studio because he's taken that book that Howard Hendricks and Bill Hendricks wrote years ago on Iron Sharpens Iron and now talks about men of influence. But anyway, you talk about the fact that Dr. Hendricks, when he was giving a talk, said that it's best that you not have a best friend. And then later you heard that in a chapel, Dr. Hendricks said, you should have a best friend. So then you said, okay, I got to figure this out. And I guess what it was is that he went back and looked at the scriptures and realized we really do need to have a friend. And when you have somebody who has been so influential in our lives being willing to publicly say, I am wrong, that also kind of underscores the need for the book, isn't it?
It underscores it, Kerby, and also it was kind of a crisis that drove him back to the Bible. That's why we all respect and love Prof so much, is because, you know, when the seminary students would leave and go out on their missions trips or just going out as pastors, and then someone would have, you know, failure as a church split, getting fired, moral failure, or whatever. Dr. Hendricks was assigned to kind of do the analysis and find out, let's figure out what happened. And he found in something like 90% of the cases, they didn't have a best friend. They were isolated. They were all alone. They had no sources of encouragement except the Lord and their spouse. And he said, I had to go back to my Bible, and there's so many verses in the Bible about support one another, love one another, speak the truth and love one another, accept one another. He said, you know, I had to change it.
That's for sure.
That changed everything, and it changed everything for me when I heard that story.
I would think so. The book is entitled People Fuel. It's published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. Those of you watching online, I'm going to hold up one very interesting diagram, because the diagram, John Townsend, is a tree. And if you want to understand the book, you need to understand the tree, because you're talking about people, performance, personal. You're talking about some of the fruit, which relates to part of that. So you have a whole section on the relational foundation, then a section part on the nutrients in 4 different quadrants, and then finally who should deliver the nutrients, the 7 C's. So in some respects, if you kind of get the idea of a tree and how the fruit and the nutrients come together, you get a pretty good idea of what you're trying to communicate in terms of relationships. True?
Absolutely. It comes from the parable in Luke 9 about the barren fig tree, when Jesus gives the metaphor of, you know, the tree wasn't working. And so God, the master, said, well, get rid of it. Why should it take up the ground? And the gardener, who was actually Jesus, the advocate, says, well, before I do that, can I dig around the soil and see if it bears fruit? And the idea there is that we all want good fruit in our life. We want to be healthy and be, have good careers, great families, be emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy, and all those things. We want really good fruit. And sometimes when it's not working, we just try harder, Kerby. Well, I'll get up earlier in the morning, or I'll just tell myself to discipline myself. And those are fine. But the Bible says that's not what transforms you. What transforms you is getting different nutrients in the soil of your life that go up and change the fruit. And that means the best relationships, the best healthy, vulnerable, truth-telling, challenging, accepting relationships out there. That's what changes all our fruit.
So when we come back from the break, we'll talk about some of the different quadrants in terms of the relational nutrients: be present, convey the good, provide reality, call to action. And then we'll talk about who delivers them. And there's no way that we can, even in a short interview here, give you all of the material in the 200-page book. But this is one of the reasons why, first of all, we have a link so that you can get a copy of the book if you can't find it in your local bookstore. I would imagine it would probably be there. And then we also have, of course, a link to Dr. John Townsend's website. It's just drtownsend.com. So you can get the book right there, and all sorts of other books that he has written and some of the other material. And if you find yourself wanting to learn more about leadership or a variety of other opportunities that exist, we'll talk about the Townsend Institute. We'll talk about some of the coaching and consulting and some of the other resources that are available there. In addition to the books, we encourage you to go to that website. And it's very simple. It's drtownsend.com. But no problem. You can simply go to the website, pointofview.net, and that will give you the link that you need. We'll continue our conversation talking about some of those nutrients that feed that tree right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Ryan Anderson responds to our transgender moment in his new book, When Harry Became Sally. He begins his discussion by comparing two movies. The classic film, When Harry Met Sally, explored the question of whether a man and a woman can really be just friends. More recently, the film The Danish Girl asked a different question. Can a man really become a woman? The film was based on the true story of the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. America is in the midst of what has become the transgender moment. When he was on my radio program, we talked about how fast this all took place. Most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within a year it became the latest civil rights cause. He said that the book in many ways provides support for the actions by Dr. Paul McHugh. He is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School who raised important questions about the effectiveness of hormonal treatments and sex reassignment surgery. This 250-page book with 30 pages of endnotes attempts to provide a comprehensive look at the transgender movement and policies that have been proposed to address the demands of transgender activists. We also talked about how transgender concepts are being taught in the schools. There's the genderbread person that is supposed to help children sort through how their gender identity and gender expression relates to their biological sex. And there is the gender unicorn that is supposed to help them understand who they may be physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to. He also documents how some young people exhibit gender dysphoria but later become more comfortable with their sexuality. Transgender activists have so misrepresented this book that I wonder if they even read the same book I read. That is one more reason why I recommend that you get the book and read it for yourself. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with John Townsend. And again, the book is entitled People Fuel. It's published by Zondervan. You can find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to drtownsend.com. And if nothing else, John, I thought we, for just a minute, would talk about this list of nutrients. You're really helping people understand what you need, developing the skill to receive those. And of course, you also address the idea, some people think, well, this would be selfish. Well, no, I mean, we all need nutrients to live. We all need relationships to flourish. So this isn't being narcissistic or selfish. It's recognizing that sometimes we live an anemic life, if you will, if I can keep that illustration that you used going, and we need to make sure that we eat right. And we certainly need to recognize the importance of these relationships. So you help us understand what those nutrients are and then spend some time also talking about how those are delivered.
Sure, Kirby. You know, Proverbs 4:23 says that we need to guard our heart, for from it are the well springs of life. And so if we're not making sure our brain is working right, our heart is working right, if we're not guarding it by feeding it right, we won't have any well springs. And the thing is, that's how we give to other people. The person who gets their needs met is going to give to other people. Jesus said, freely you receive, now freely give. So, the model I've got has, there are 22 nutrients like your basic bio, like iron, calcium, and that sort of thing. I've got 22 nutrients, but they're categorized. The big pictures are categorized into 4 groups or quadrants. So group 1 is you got to learn how to be present with others. The second one is deliver the good. Third one is convey reality. And then the fourth one is call to action. Now, in the first one, learn to be present. Basically, Kirby, that means shut up and listen, which we're not good at it sometimes.
Very true.
We want to give people advice and free solutions, and that's great. Sometimes people need just to be there with you. You know, the only thing that Job's friends did that was any good was in Job chapter 2, where it said they sat with him 7 days and 7 nights and did not speak a word to him, for they saw his grief was very great. Sometimes people just need you to be in the well with them, the well of challenge, the well of being overwhelmed, the well of being discouraged. And people begin to feel like somebody gets me. They understand me. I don't need advice right now. I don't even need cheering up right now. Right now, I just need to know that I'm not all alone with this. Very powerful nutrient is being present with each other.
And so that's one of those. Yeah, go ahead. Convey the good, provide reality, call to action. Talk about the others if you might.
Yeah. Now, we move from being present because sometimes we go, okay, I really feel understood. I feel like you get how my heart is, you get how my life is. But I'm sort of down. I don't believe in myself, or something bad happened to one of my kids, or something bad happened at work, and I'm discouraged. Well, that's when we need to deliver the good. That's things like encouragement and things like respect and hope. Like, I believe in you. I know that you feel like you messed up on the account, but I believe in you as a good person. We need to be that shot of positivity for other people sometimes, and need that from other people. And then thirdly, it's provide reality. Sometimes we need kind of in a Star Wars world, we need a Yoda figure, somebody who's really wise and can think about things at a different angle and come at them and say, try this approach. I think also about Simon Sinek's great TED talk about the power of why and how powerful a word that is. There's some really good why people out there who will help you to find out, why isn't life going right? Why isn't my faith life, my business life, my financial life, why isn't my marriage going right? And they'll get you to that. You got to have people that can deliver the good, deliver the reality, deliver the data, and deliver insight. And the fourth one is call to action, which means sometimes we've got to get off of our lazy boy and do something. There's a behavior to act on, like I've got to have that tough conversation with somebody I've been avoiding, or I've got to start that business I've been dreaming about, or get that website going, or go on a conference with my spouse. And so we need people to challenge us to actually behave in a different way. And it's our job to know every morning when you wake up, what is it I need? Do I need someone present with me, delivering good to me? What do I need? Get reality? Do I need a call to action? And what do others that I'm going to be meeting with need? And that's how we help each other stay healthy and motivated.
And I was just thinking how much this connects up with some of the conversation we've had, for example, with Bill Hendricks and others on mentoring and the rest. And then you have a section on, of course, how to deliver the nutrients, the 7 C's. These would be coaches, comrades, casuals, which would be people that are acquaintances, colleagues, care, chronics, contaminants. And again, as people work through the book, I think this is going to be very helpful. But I wanted to feature for a few minutes, if I could, you have the Townsend Institute, and you also have Townsend Now, which is an online assessment and a number of other things. People might say, well, I'd like to get the book, but as soon as I get the book in my hands, I'm going to say, I need a little more help. And that is something that you've been providing for many years, isn't it?
Yeah, we really try to give people help at lots of levels and lots of content for various needs. The Institute, we have actually an academic graduate program here, Kerby, that we provide people with an accredited master's in counseling, who those feel called to be a counselor, or a master's in organizational leadership for leaders, or one for executive coaching and consulting. And they're all master's degrees, or a person can just get a credential as well, and we now have a bachelor's program. It's all fully online, and it's all based on the hard science, the neuroscience, scripture, the theology, and my own experience. We've got a great staff and great faculties, and we've got hundreds of students around the world, and we're moderately priced.
There are probably a number of our listeners right now that, like you, maybe have graduated from seminary, and they're pastors or they're Sunday school teachers or Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders, and they might say, this is something we really need. We need to develop the body life in our congregation, in our small group, whatever it might be. And it seems to me that the way you've put this together really gives people, if you will, a tree to hang on, literally, and then all sorts of ways in which you can take, for example, a 15-day relationship challenge. So for just a few minutes, John, talk about how people can use this book. I would certainly recommend people reading it on their own, but I do believe that the way you've put this together could really be used in a group setting and allow some of the kind of dynamics that you're talking about to grow right there in that particular life team. Yeah.
Kerby used the right term, body life, because we have a concept in the book called Life Team, which is having a group of people, between 3 and 10 people, that really want to be serious and intentional about growth, self-improvement, spiritual growth, emotional growth, family growth, all those sorts of things. And there are different, let's just call them skills and tools in the book to help them with that. For one, there's an assessment tool in there, the TPRAT, Townsend Personal Relational Assessment Tool. I wrote it. It takes 10 minutes online, which we can find out how you're doing and how well you connect, how well you have set boundaries and that sort of thing. And that comes with the book. That's free. And then there's also the ability to use the Townsend Now material, which is videos that you can look at and see the sort of thing. The idea is that people grow better in community than they do by themselves. It's just how we're wired. We found this out from so much neuroscience, that when you actually sit down and you challenge each other and accept each other and listen to each other, there's something wonderful that happens. You know, back in the Dallas Seminary days, Gene Getz was one of my professors, and he used to say, all you got to do is study the one another's and you'll be okay. And nowadays we go to our Bible app on our iPhone and just type in the commentary in the search section, one another, and you find out, I've got to be in a group. I might not be around perfect people, but I'm not perfect either. But once I get in a group with people that really want to grow, I've got the right material, the miracles happen.
Wow. Gene Getz has been on with us recently as we've talked about his Bible. But let me also mention again that Townsend Now, because there is an opportunity for people to have access to more than 100 different videos. I noticed that you can actually get the first month of membership free, so you can kind of try it out and learn a little bit more. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get some coaching and consulting, I'd like to know more about this leadership program, I want to know more about the TRAT, all of that, the Townsend Personal and Relational Assessment Tool, all of that is on the website. And so, again, we've made it very easy for you to find that, drtownsend.com. And also wanted to feature this book today. It is just out. It is published by Zondervan, People Fuel, Fill Your Tank for Life, Love, and Leadership. And you will learn a lot about those nutrients in your life and how to deliver those and how to receive those. And so, Dr. John Townsend, it's always great to hear from you, and I encourage people to go and spend some more time with you on the website and connect up with you, maybe invite you to come and speak at their church.
Happy to do it. We also have a leadership program that's non-academic, Kirby, for just people that want to grow in a small group in their community. We've got leaders, trainers all over the country now in Townsend Leadership Program as well.
Well, just a great material. Again, I want you to know about the book. It's published by Zondervan. You can look for it in the local bookstore or simply go to drtownsend.com. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we have some things in the news, and so I just wanted you to know a little bit more about what he is working on, and we have that link in case you are driving right now and didn't have a chance to write it down. It is all available to you and a great resource to help you learn to live, to love, and to lead well. That's kind of one of the comments by Andy Stanley, who did the endorsement of the book. And just a fascinating look at this whole idea of relationships. It is something that is key, and as he points out, all you need to do is look at the scriptures, and it talks about one another, and there are so many one another passages that are so essential and certainly what the Bible encourages us to do. So I just wanted you to know about the book. When we come back, though, I want to get into a couple of other issues in the news, and we'll start off with this really profound letter written by Dennis Prager. You'll understand why right after these important messages.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Put a lot on the table. And I have a few more things I'd like to put on the table. And one of those is a letter, open letter to Sergey Brin. From Dennis Prager. Now, you know Dennis Prager. He's been on the program with us before. I so often find myself appreciating his columns, commentaries, even his books and resources, and, of course, the PragerU videos, which is part of the reason for this letter because of the, if you will, censorship of the Prager University videos. But he's writing to Sergey Brin. You might go, okay, I really don't know who he is. Well, first of all, he's the 10th richest person in the world. He was the co-founder of Google. Does that make sense? And is the head of Alphabet Inc., which is the group that, of course, oversees Google. And, of course, they also own YouTube. And you kind of know where we're going because Dennis Prager's YouTubes have been highly restricted and you could say censored. What you need to understand before we get into this is Sergey Brin was born in Moscow. His parents, interestingly enough, eventually decided they wanted to emigrate to America. They were Russian Jews. This is where Dennis Prager comes in and I think really brings some good points to it. As soon as his father applied to get a visa, which means there was no guarantee that he could leave, he was fired from his job, and they really struggled for months, but eventually came over to this country. And, of course, Sergey Brin has got one of the all-time success stories. A son of a Russian immigrant comes here and now one of the richest people in the world. Okay, so that's the setup. And we have posted this article for you to read in its entirety, and I think I might read most of it because Dennis Prager says, Mr. Brin, 50 years ago this week, I was a 21-year-old college senior. I was in the Soviet Union, sent by the government of Israel to smuggle in Jewish religious items and smuggle out names of Jews who wanted to escape the Soviet Union and could then be issued a formal invitation to Israel. I was chosen because I was a committed Jew, because I knew Hebrew and Russian. I was no hero, but the trip did entail risk. The Soviets did not appreciate people smuggling out names of Soviet citizens who sought to emigrate, information the Israeli government and activist groups in America used to advocate on their behalf. My 4 weeks in the USSR were, of course, life-changing. This young American, lucky beyond belief to have spent his entire life in the freest country in the world, experienced what it was like to live in a totalitarian police state. People feared merely being seen speaking with a Westerner, lest the KGB arrest and interrogate them. People arranged to meet me at a certain tree in a certain park and only spoke to me while walking to avoid eavesdroppers. I met with Jewish engineers, doctors, and professors who could find no work because they were known to the government to be refuseniks, Jews who had applied for exit visas to leave the Soviet Union and be refused permission. I'm sure you know of them from your parents. I left the Soviet Union angry and grateful, angry that there are people who have the audacity to tell other people what they could do and could not say, but grateful beyond measure to have been born in America, where no one could tell anyone what they could say. From that day to this, I have never taken freedom, especially freedom of speech, for granted. So now he says, why am I writing this to you? Because beyond my wildest dreams, two things are happening in America. One is that for the first time in American history, free speech is seriously threatened. In 1977, when Nazis sought to march in Skokie, Illinois, those terrible human beings chose Skokie because it was the home to many Jewish Holocaust survivors. Virtually every liberal and conservative organization, including Jewish organizations, defended the right of Nazis to march. Because in America, and only in America, it was understood that even if the most loathsome speech was not protected, all speech was at risk. He says that has changed. He says today, decent people who abhor Nazism, on every other form of evil, left or right, people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Aya Hirsi Ali, are shouted down, threatened, disinvited, or never invited to speak at American universities. The other thing that is happening is even more frightening, I should say. The company that you co-founded, Google, the greatest conduit of speech in world history, is also suppressing speech. I have asked myself over and over, how could the company founded by a man whose parents fled the Soviet Union do this? It so boggles the mind that I have to hope you are simply not aware of what your company is doing. So in a nutshell, let me tell you what Google has done to one organization, Prager University, better known as PragerU. Every week, PragerU releases a 5-minute video on virtually every subject outside of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Some of the finest minds in the world have presented these videos, including professors from Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, 4 Pulitzer Prize winners, 3 former prime ministers, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, including never-Trumpers, gays, and, of course, many women and members of ethnic and racial minorities. Yet YouTube, which Google owns, has placed hundreds of our videos on its restricted list. In addition to the inherent smear of being labeled inappropriate for children, this means that no family that filters out pornography and graphic violence, no school, and no library can see those videos. Among those restricted videos is one during former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper defends Israel. Had someone told me 50 years ago that a company led by the son of a Soviet Jewish refuseniks would suppress a video by a world leader defending the Jewish state, I would have told them they were out of their mind. That's one reason I can only assume, or at least hope, that you are not fully aware of what your company is doing. Or how about a video series I presented on the 10 Commandments? YouTube is suppressing a number of those, too. When Senator Ted Cruz asked a Google official why Google restricted one of my videos on the 10 Commandments, the official responded, it's on YouTube, that it was because the video contained references to murder, like, thou shalt not murder. Anyway, he says, in fact, PragerU has repeatedly asked Google over the past several years why any of our videos are on the restricted list, and we have received either a runaround or silence. We have never received a substantive explanation. We have no desire to see government interfere in private business to protect free speech, but your company has availed itself of protections under the law that shield it from liability for defamation, copy infringement, etc. Your company's arrogance is such that a vast number of Americans, liberals as well as conservatives, are worried that the major conduit of speech in the free world doesn't care about free speech. Mr. Brin, along with millions of other Americans, I fought to bring your parents from a land with no freedom to the land of the free. None of us have ever asked for anything in return. It was our honor to work for liberty in general and for Soviet Jewry specifically. What Americans most want from immigrants is that they help keep America free. I've never had any doubt that those leaving the Soviet Union would fulfill that mission. Until now. He says the freedom of speech is the most fundamental of all freedoms. It's what your parents yearned for and bequeathed to you. Please don't take it away from those who made it possible, the people of America. Sincerely yours, Dennis Prager. Well, if you've been paying attention to anything we've talked about, even in my most recent booklet that we've made available to you on social media, my social media booklet spends a little bit of time talking about the dangers of engaging in too much social media because these digital devices sometimes are rewiring our brains. But that's only half of the booklet, because the other half really spends our time talking about all the censorship in one way or another that's taking place from the big tech companies. Now, again, when Dennis Prager was on the program with us the other day, he used the illustration that, okay, we recognize these are private companies, but he uses the illustration in an editorial that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Can you imagine the outrage if all the major airlines decided that one day they would not allow anybody to get on an airplane that was holding a copy of the Wall Street Journal or subscribe to the Wall Street Journal? And you can, of course, see the problem with that particular idea. And if you've been receiving my Viewpoints commentary, you know that I just recently, as a matter of fact, I think it was on Monday, had a commentary talking about how the attorneys general in 51 different states, led in large part by the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, want an investigation into some of these big tech companies, in particular Google. And so this is another way to maybe get their attention. You would hope that just a letter like this might prick the conscience of Sergey Brin, thinking about the fact that his parents left a country which actually did its best to prevent free speech so that they could come to this country and enjoy the free speech that we all take for granted, including the free speech we're engaging in right now here on radio. And you would hope that that would be enough, but if nothing else, the investigations now are going to just help us understand why indeed is this taking place. So if you'd like to read the letter, it's the first article on our website, pointofview.net. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll get into a couple of issues in the news right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just mention as a program note, tomorrow we're going to have Jerry Tuma in. And, of course, we've been looking at what has been happening in China. And it is interesting. Of course, we won't talk that much about LeBron James. We've got a lot of other issues to talk about as well. And we'll look at what is happening in the financial world, because there's been a lot of uncertainty until now about what is going to happen. People have been waiting for the other shoe to drop. And if there's one thing that Wall Street doesn't like, one thing businesses don't like in general, so whether it's Wall Street or Main Street, it's the uncertainty. Even if it's a bad policy, they'd rather take the bad policy and then just work around it. But when we don't know what's coming next, that's always been an issue. Well, now that we seem to have a little bit of a truce on the trade wars with China, that's good news for farmers, good news for business, good news for investors. So we'll see where that takes us. And so we'll spend some time with him. And then Eric Metaxas will be with us. He's got a children's book about Donald Trump building the wall, but we'll get into some other issues with him. And I'm sure he'll have a few comments about the presidential debates. So we'll get into all that with him tomorrow. So I hope you'll be tuning in then. Let me just mention that if there's one theme that runs through Point of View so often, it's the need for discernment. And one of the things that we try to do every once in a while is do a fact check or point you to an article doing a fact check. What do you do when the fact checkers leave out the facts? That's a question that was raised just the other day by the Daily Signal by John Cooper, in which they point out that CNN did a fact check. And the fact check was this. They argued that President Trump significantly exaggerated the sad state of affairs of the munitions stockpile when he became president. In other words, the justification he made for why we need to build up the military and provide the resources necessary to keep the military strong, they argued in their fact check was extreme, and that the president engaged in hyperbole. And the president sometimes does, so I'm not saying that it never happens. But there's a real problem, John Cooper points out. CNN completely omitted the data that was provided to them by, for example, the Heritage Foundation. And you didn't even have to use the Heritage Foundation stuff. He points out, for example, that publicly available data from the U.S. Central Command and the Secretary of Air Force and others point out that there were actually, during the Obama administration, twice as many precision-guided munitions, think smart bombs basically, in the 3 years than were actually being produced. So they were running out of the various munitions necessary. And it goes into, for 2.5 pages, all sorts of facts that simply did not get into the CNN fact check. So the point is that we try from time to time to give you fact checking, but sometimes the fact checkers have a bias, or the fact checkers just ignore things. Maybe they don't even necessarily understand the story. So it's one more reason to read widely and to recognize that if you just saw the CNN fact check, you'd say, well, it's just another example where President Obama exaggerated. It really wasn't that bad. And we really didn't need to spend all this money on the military. No, it really was that bad. And that's well documented in a piece in the Daily Signal. So I just thought I'd bring that up because it's a good illustration, again, of why you just need to pay attention, read a lot, check things out, and don't trust somebody just because they say it. One of the topics that I thought would be important to bring to the table is also a very important speech given last week. And you've heard me from time to time say that the president gave a very important speech at the United Nations and it hardly got covered. Well, the speech by the Attorney General at Notre Dame is one that deserved a great deal of attention and simply was ignored. And our good friend Gary Bauer has some time to talk about this, if for no other reason than the fact that some of these leftist commentators who did talk about it attacked it. And so he asks a very good question. What did Barr say to trigger such outrage? I mean, this, after all, is the Attorney General of the United States. And he said, well, he dared to state the obvious, that for decades the left has been waging war against religion, and that men and women of faith are having secularism forced on them by the popular culture, and in some cases even by the government. And so the Attorney General, William Barr, linked the war on faith to an explosion of social ills, drug use, suicide, breakdown of the family, declining birth rates, and you could add, of course, the growing corruption in the government and the corporate world and things like that. So Gary Bauer then asked this good question. If a company instituted a new policy that turned out to be an utter disaster, he says, think New Coke, back for those of us who remember New Coke, it would quickly change course and correct the decision. But he says nobody on the secular left is doing any soul searching or expressing any regret about the constant attack against religious liberty that is resulting from so much suffering. No, he says the left is doubling down. It's becoming even more aggressive, as we saw the last week's call to strip churches of their tax-exempt status and let's say preach from, as he says, the gospel of progressivism. He says the left is all in on a society where the faithful have zero influence. Never mind that our country, founded on the principle that only a moral people could remain free, is today littered with casualties from the left's war on faith. He says, how much more wreckage in the families and in our communities and our culture must we endure? And he says, interestingly, no one on the left is demanding the opportunity to debate the Attorney General. No, they simply want to shut him up and silence anyone who would dare to defend faith in the public sphere. A debate on the rise of radical secularism and its impact would be the worst possible income for the left. And so that kind of brings us back to, of course, Representative or former Representative Beto O'Rourke, who, of course, made it very clear that He would certainly like to remove the tax-exempt status from various groups. And as I pointed out earlier, he, in his campaign, then acknowledged maybe we would only want to remove rewards and benefits or tax breaks from those who were taking discriminatory action, not discriminatory beliefs. But a very good piece that came out with Peter Kurenschanau actually went on to say that, much of this commentary is not unrepresentative of the progressive secular left's view. If anything, this is exactly what they have been calling for. As a matter of fact, he says that Beto O'Rourke's comments are unremarkable on the left, which generally, he says, elevates non-discrimination over religious liberty. And the example he uses, interestingly enough, since he's been involved with this, is to look at what has been happening right now at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, in which the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights held an expansive hearing just a few years ago on peaceful coexistence, reconciling non-discrimination principles with civil liberties. And the hostility, points out, of the left's towards religious freedom was noteworthy, and there really isn't any place for peaceful coexistence, much less an effort to balance the interest of religious freedom with religious discrimination, with so-called secular non-discrimination. And so the point he's making is that we are finding ourselves more and more where the issue of religious liberty used to be something that people would hold in very high esteem. It'd be like being a civil rights lawyer fighting for the civil rights of individuals. And if you were fighting for the religious liberty of individuals, people would say, good, you're kind of like a civil rights lawyer. Now it's just seen as an excuse, a very weak excuse, I might say sometimes, that they will say, for you to just simply discriminate against individuals. And so this is, I think, an illustration of the fact that even though there are people that are trying to walk back some of the statements by former Representative Beto O'Rourke, the reality is, for a very significant number of people in the left, that's exactly what they believe. So that's all we have for today. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about how I can help Syrian refugees, like more about relationships, maybe like to see this very well-written letter by Dennis Prager of Sergi Brin, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. And I hope you'll join us tomorrow. We're going to spend some time talking with Jerry Tuma about finances. We'll be talking with Eric Metaxas, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I'll join you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.